Welcome, student, to this virtual lecture on the history of linguistics. Last year, you were introduced to language, linguistics, and their relationship. In this unit, we'll embark through the rich tapestry of linguistic thought, tracing the evolution of our understanding of language, starting from antiquity and progressing through various cultures and civilizations to understand how the study of language has evolved over time. Language, as a fundamental aspect of human communication, has fascinated thinkers across cultures and civilizations. The study of linguistics seeks to understand its intricacies and complexities. Let's embark on a journey through the fascinating history of linguistics, exploring its evolution from antiquity to the present day. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain the highlights of the history of linguistics, identify the major periods, phases, and individuals that played significant roles in shaping the field of linguistics, and describe the aims and relevance of linguistics as well. The history of linguistics is concerned with the various forms which the discipline we call linguistics took in the past, with the diverse ideas that past thinkers had about language and with the text in which they recorded their ideas. Despite its fragmentation into disciplines, linguistics offers us a shortcut, for language mirrors the nature of man. Consequently, views about language are a guide to views of man. By studying the history of linguistics, we can form a pretty good idea of how people saw the human being in any given epoch. The discipline of linguistics can be likened, or let's say compared, to a pathway which is being cut through the dark and mysterious forest of language. Different parts of the forest have been explored at different times, so we can depict the path as a winding one. As the figure shows, there have been three major directions in linguistics. Let us discuss each of these in more detail. Okay, so our journey begins in antiquity, where the roots of linguistic inquiry can be traced in societies with established traditions of writing. Linguistics must have started in the moment in which the first reflections upon language are produced. It coincides with the creation of the different writing systems. This is because all forms of graphic representation imply a given type of analysis of linguistic issues. In most cases, these traditions arose in response to language change and the resulting impact on religious and legal domains. The earliest linguistic texts written in cuneiform on clay tablets date almost 4,000 years before the present. For thousands of years, cuneiform was the means of transmitting information through space and time in the ancient world. In the early centuries of the second millennium BC, in southern Mesopotamia arose a grammatical tradition that lasted for more than 2,500 years. Mesopotamia is thought to be one of the places where early civilizations developed. These civilizations, such as Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Elamites, and Assyrians, had an intrinsic interest in language, using it as a tool for communication and record keeping. These peoples are credited with influencing mathematics and astronomy. The Babylonians had a written language that they used for trade and communication. They got it from the Sumerians, who invented it. They wrote in two different languages, the Sumerian for religious purposes and Akkadian for official purposes. This abstract form of writing was based on cuneiform symbols written on wet clay tablets. Well, Europe contributed a lot to the study of linguistics. However, in the oriental part of the world, in Eastern world, we had India. India arose a body of knowledge which brought revolution in European ideas about linguistic analysis. Hindu tradition had its origin in the first millennium BC. The ancient literary texts, the Vedas, which was written in Sanskrit, the sacred language of religious texts of Hinduism, was studied by Hindu priests and contributed immensely to the field of language study. Language change stimulated the Hindu tradition. Sanskrit, the sacred language, was changing, but the Hindus required correct verbal performance for the religious text. Ritual required the exact verbal performance of the religious text, and the grammatical tradition emerged that set out rules for the ancient language. So this is how the Indian tradition evolved. Okay, then we have Panini. Well, I hope that you're not starving, because panini is not sandwich. He's not named after the Italian sandwich. The Italian sandwich is not named after him. As a conclusion, he's neither a sandwich nor an Italian. So Panini is a grammarian. So, the best-known grammarian from this tradition is Panini, whose grammar covered phonetics and morphology. It's Panini who actually gave the idea that the sounds in a language should be also studied. He said we shouldn't focus only on words or sentences, rather, sounds are also important because the internal structure of the words could be decided by the study of sounds. Panini wrote a grammar of Sanskrit called the Eight Books. The Indian theory and practice was definitely in advance of anything achieved in Europe or elsewhere before contact had been made with Indian work. Hindu tradition of linguistics far surpassed anything done in Europe for a very long time. The Indic or the Hindu tradition was very unique. It was independent, it was different from the other traditions. Now, our journey takes a significant turn in ancient Greece, where philosophical inquiry expanded to include the nature of language. The Greeks are the ones who should be given a lot of credit for putting language at the forefront as far as grammar is concerned. So, initially, it started as traditional grammar studies, and the Greeks were the pioneers, they were the leaders in this field. Well, the good thing that the Greeks had is that they had the gift of wondering at things that people would take for granted. We don't really think much about language, but the Greeks had this inherent inquisitive attitude which actually helped them to contribute a lot to the human learning. They also speculated persistently about history, origin, and development of language. No other civilization, no other community was that strong or that bold enough to talk about the history and development of language. It's the Greeks who actually should have the credit. However, there was a tiny limitation. Ancient Greeks studied no language but their own, because the community system wasn't as wide as it is nowadays. The Greek structure was considered the universal form of human thought, which is not correct. The universe, was not restricted or limited to the Greeks only. However, since the scholars studied their language, there was an assumption that all human languages or all human thoughts concentrated on how the Greeks think or how the Greeks interpreted language. So that was the limitation, or let's say the drawback that the Greeks had. But the good thing that they did is that they studied language in the most thorough manner. It was in 300 BC that linguistics was said to have a defined role from the perspective of philosophy, when the Stoic and Alexandrian schools of thought were born. The school in Alexandria, though not having a linguistic structure as its central object of study, studied language using its method of philological criticism. The Alexandrians are famous for their remarkable challenge against language change and negative attitudes towards its various manifestations. Okay, now the Stoics are credited with formalization of the dichotomy between form and meaning. According to them, form refers to the signifier, while meaning refers to the signified. These terms were to be later used in the work of Saussure to refer to sound and thought in his book named Cours de linguistique générale. The Greeks made a distinction between phonetics, etymology, and syntax. Themes of importance in the Greek tradition included the origin of language, part of speech systems, the relation between language and thought, and the relation between the two aspects of word science, whether form and meaning are connected by nature or purely by convention. Thus, the Greeks posed questions concerning language within their tradition of philosophical thinking. Between the Stoics and the Alexandrians, there were opposing views about nature and convention as the frameworks within which language-related issues such as the relation between words and the meaning were examined. The Alexandrians, who held the view that language was by nature systematic and regular, that is to say, they supported the assumption that this relationship is based on nature. The fact that this relationship is natural means that it's out of man's intervention. The Alexandrians were called analogists, while the Stoics, who held the view that language was by convention irregular, that is to say, they disbelieved in the word naturalness, they give priority to convention and the habit of using this convention between words and concepts. The Stoics were called anomalists. Okay, so various Greek scholars contributed to the growth of linguistics. For example, Protagoras was credited with the distinction of three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. Plato, on the other hand, distinguished between nouns and verbs. The definitions are different, though. While Plato defined nouns and verbs, his definitions were different from the common understanding of nouns and verbs. So for Plato, nouns are terms that could function in sentences as the subject of predication, but not all nouns should be treated as subject of predication, not necessarily. There is also non-subject predication, which can also be nouns. Similarly, verbs for Plato are terms which could express the action or quality predicated. So, in a way, it's okay. So, generally, the verbs do express action, but not all verbs actually express action. We have the non-action verbs, for example, the helping or the auxiliary verbs. There are also verbs which talk about emotions. So what about those? Therefore, not all verbs are always related to action. Plato's definition got changed later, but if you think about society at that time, this was one of the biggest achievements that philosophers had. Then we have Aristotle, whose contribution was to add conjunctions. He also categorized tense. So tense as a system in any human language was found primarily by Aristotle. The first surviving grammar of a European language is a short description of the Greeks by Thrax. Thrax was the first to present and publish a comprehensive grammar of Greek in the Western world. His grammar remained a standard work for 13 centuries. Thrax considered grammar as the technical knowledge of language with 8 parts of speech. The growth of linguistics in Rome was similar to that of Greece. The Romans made significant contributions to linguistics, particularly through their focus on rhetoric, grammar, and the practical aspects of language. Let's delve into the role in the history of linguistics. Roman philosophers studied Latin grammar. They were meticulous in their approach to language, and the study of Latin grammar became a formalized discipline. However, the Greek philosophers were said to have been a great influence on their Roman counterparts. The Roman philosophers used the Greek model in the analysis of Latin. The similar structures of Greek and Latin also made this possible. Roman linguistics continued studying the themes of interest to Greek linguistics. The primary interest was in morphology, particularly parts of speech and the forms of nouns and verbs, but syntax was largely ignored. Grammarians such as Varro focused on analyzing the structure of the Latin language. Varro's work, De Lingua Latina, explored etymology, morphology, and syntax, contributing to a systematic understanding of Latin grammar. His categorization of part of speech and linguistic classifications influenced later grammarians. The Roman scholar Varro produced the 25 volumes of his De Lingua Latina. Varro contrasted Latin with Greek, changed Greek grammatical terms into Latin, and formed his grammar of Latin by adapting Greek rules. Thus, the Romans took over the Greek's description of language and brought it into perfection. As our journey continues, we explore the contributions of Arabic linguistics. During the Islamic Golden Age, scholars like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina made significant strides in phonetics, morphology, and syntax. Al-Farabi delved into the philosophy of language, addressing topics such as semantics and the relationship between language and thought. His insights laid foundations for later Arabic linguistic scholarship. Renowned for his contributions to various fields, Ibn Sina made strides in Arabic linguistics. His works on phonetics and syntax were influential in shaping linguistic thought during his era. Sibawayh, often referred to as the father of Arabic grammar, and Sibawayh's Kitab is a monumental work that systematically explored Arabic grammar. His emphasis on empirical observation and analysis set a standard for linguistic inquiry. Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad is recognized for developing the system of grammatical analysis known as Al-Khalil's scale. He made significant contributions to the study of Arabic morphology. For Arabic grammarians, the Arabic language was sacred as enshrined in the Quran, and they were concerned with explaining why Arabic was perfect. The motivation behind the Arabic grammatical study rested on resistance against language change to preserve the Quranic language. Well, this lecture has sketched out the main directions taken by linguistics in the past 200 years. The next lecture will consider how languages come into contact with each other, how they influence each other, and how the world came to know about the other languages. Well, that's all for today. See you for the next adventure. This recorded presentation is based on the following references.